All right, this is Brent Rains of Alternate Perceptions down here in Tennessee, reaching out again to Peter Jordan up there in New Jersey about all his past experiences and research into UFOs, paranormal. I guess we'd call you a 14, Peter, for sure.
Yep.
And uh, and anyway, last week at about this time, we were talking about Howard Menger and that whole legacy and many of the different people you had interviewed as well as him. And excuse the frog in my throat right now. And the Val Thor, legend. And so anyway, I guess this time we'll be moving on to some other topics as well of great interest.
Yeah, there's no scarcity of material or of things to talk about. That's for sure. And I've researched a fair share of them. Not all 14. Some I've done at a distance from just reading about them or corresponding with people that were experts, as it were, in those particular areas. And but in many other cases, I actually took the deep dive into actually researching it, boots on the ground, that type of thing, um, at my own peril and the peril of others who have done the same. Uh, so most of that's psychic or psychological peril more than anything physical. Thankfully, you know, um, some haven't as fared as well as others, but it's lessons learned in a lot of things, and I think you and I were talking about before we got started here about how um, when you become personally involved in many of these cases, that there's a big difference between um, experiencing the phenomenon as an investigator, as somebody who's connected to experiencers and at the particular region where something has taken place, um, looking at all the data, um, listening to countless interviews, making those interviews, creating a rapport between yourself and often frightened experiencers who are looking for some sort of comfort, are looking for somebody that's not going to um, you know, cast derision upon them or be suspicious about who they are. So there's a lot of emotional baggage that goes, I believe, with becoming an investigator. Um, as opposed to just being someone who's sort of looking at it from a distance, or even someone who's just researching something in a library, or just Googling information and reading articles online or so forth and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's part of investigation. That's part of curiosity and intellectual curiosity and but the experience of actually going to a particular location, standing in a particular location where somebody has experienced something, regardless of what it is, whether it was a Sasquatch sighting or a UFO sighting, a close encounter, spontaneous human combustion, wherever it is, it makes its mark on you. And um, that can take its toll. That can take its toll, especially if you become too emotionally engaged in those particular experiences. So one must learn, and this is learned over time, to sort of pull yourself out and sort of look at it, as objectively as you possibly can. And sometimes it's very hard when you're in these situations, where it's emotional and volatile. Um, where you might be involved in something where there's domestic disputes going on, like in a poltergeist case where, you have a couple, or family members that are embroiled in um, arguments, you know. When you step into that kind of an environment, emotionally charged environment, it's very difficult to not feel something one way or the other. And so what you really have to do is, as best as you possibly can, sort of separate from yourself from it and to look at it as objectively as you possibly can. And it's really hard to do when you get involved in a lot of the things that I've been involved in. And it's true for all investigators. And as I said, some become victimized by it. And we can go back in time and look at people that I think were victimized by John Keel, for example. If you look back, some of the correspondence that Keel was having with other researchers uh, in the field, uh, it shows this mounting paranoia, um, which was coming from what? From things that maybe a medium or a psychic out on Long Island is telling him, right? Moon owl, remember that? Um,
Hmm.
or maybe it's because you have pranksters like Jim Mosley. Every
Yes.
time I think of Jim Mosley, I just want to laugh. I mean, and some of the things he did, almost bordered on cruelty. What he would do, what he thought was funny. And Gray Barker wasn't too far behind. And when those two got together and they started drinking, you know, all hell would break loose and you didn't know what they were going to do. And Keel, you know, with somebody that they knew they could victimize pretty easily because during this time with MIB experiences and the Mothman and doppelgangers and all these things taking place and telephones going click or hearing other voices on a phone that shouldn't be there, finding taps on your phones, just endless, right? Um, it, it was just easy to take someone like that and to sort of make them even crazier, and the point of all of that is one has to be very careful that you don't self-victimize, that you don't constantly allow yourself to be frightened all the time, you know. And I remember Greg Bishop in one of his podcasts when somebody asked him, they said, you know, are you ever scared? And he goes, I was for a long time. And they said, well, what changed? And he said, one day I just decided I didn't want to be scared anymore. And I thought that was really interesting. That sounds simplistic, but it isn't simplistic. It isn't simplistic because when you say to yourself, I'm not going to allow this to affect me, I'm not going to allow this to ruin my relationships with people, to poison my life, or to fill my head with possibly suicidal um, thoughts and ideation, then you realize, you can be healthy and you can still be an investigator. I mean, we don't see a lot of that, a lot we've seen it take its toll on so many people, you know, who became massively paranoid. Uh, I saw it over and over again, or they get thrown from one particular point of view to another extremist point of view. It could be a religious point of view where suddenly, they went from being agnostic or atheist, and now because of what's happened, you know, they just paint everything with this broad demonic brush. And it's the jinn, it's that, and so they end up in that camp, and that sometimes, if it's too extremist, can be just as bad, right? Because it's still fear
Hmm.
stoked, you
Yeah.
know if it's an extremist religious point of view, just like any exceedingly skeptical scientific point of view also is dangerous. Dangerous in a different way, not so much dangerous in the sense that it can lead to paranoia. In fact, it's just the opposite. I think for people that are in the tribalist camp of being extremists, they're in a very, very luxurious position, because that luxurious position affords them the opportunity to be able to say, I know what that is. That's ball lightning. That's a plasma ball. Uh, this is just Uri Geller's just using magic. It's a sleight of hand. Regardless, if you fall into those camps, um, it's easy to just look at the world as this very neat place that's just closed off from everything above and below it, and just say, okay, we can make this nice and tidy because using materialistic scientific uh, modes of observation, we can explain all of this. And so what that does, that's very comforting. That doesn't lead to paranoia or any of that kind of thing. And so you can go through your whole life because in your mind, you know, it's settled what it is. And so that's where many of those end up. But the people in this field who go the opposite way and come to believe that it's aliens from Alpha Centauri, or if it's the Nordics or Grace, the Greys are in my room again. This is happening, and this is not to, you know, insult anyone who believes that's happening. Again, there's the phenomenology of the experience in which people very often are having actual experiences that I don't think can all be classified as sleep paralysis, by the way. That's a common thing. Oh, that
Mhm.
was sleep paralysis. That's okay. Yeah, well, what about, I heard that with Betty and Barney Hill. I'm thinking, sleep paralysis? Really? Okay. They're driving in a car and what? They fell asleep and they had sleep paralysis in the car. I mean, we can get a little carried away with that kind of thing, or where people wake up and they're moving around and then they go back to sleep and people say, well, that was sleep paralysis. You really didn't get up. You just thought you got out of bed, but you were still asleep. And what they'll do, what a lot of materialistic scientists will do, include especially psychologists, is just try to find a way to make that fit, you know in a very Procrustean way. You remember Procrustes, who was this Greek god, and what he would do is he had this device. I forget what it was, like where he could. It was on a machine where uh, it was like a torture device, and a lot of times the bodies wouldn't fit, so he would actually stretch their body or cut off limbs so that they would fit. So I
Mm.
always like that metaphor of, being Procrustean. And that's what I think a lot of scientists are. They're Procrustean in the sense, well, that doesn't fit exactly, but damn it, I'm going to make it fit.
All right.
And we saw that with Philip Klass and a lot of people like that, where, I remember one with Philip Klass where I was reading in his book, and he's talking about the Socorro, uh, New Mexico incident, which I'm sure listeners or some listeners will remember. You know, very important case with Loni Zamora, and he sees the object and these human-like figures standing next to it, and the thing takes off. And of course, um, and apparently there was a witness or somebody who heard the sound of this object taking off at the time, and it was like this guard shack, I believe it was, nearby where the guy was there. And Philip Klass says, the guy in the shack didn't hear a thing. Now, if this is making that kind of racket, it's only so many yards away from there, he would have heard it. Well, it turns out he was congenitally deaf. He never pointed that out. I went and looked into that, and I found out that was one thing I found in the book that I actually found out was completely made up. He had never even researched it because it wouldn't fit otherwise. That's Procrustean science. To say that all objects that are seen, are ball lightning, or and that came about through the Exeter, New Hampshire incidents where the objects were seen above the power lines, and so it was assumed that through that you could generate these energy levels that would create plasma. In some cases, that can happen, but not in all cases. So again, um, to make these sweeping generalities about phenomena, we have to take everything on its own merits and on a case by case basis. Because again, the problem I find a lot of researchers run into is generalizing. And it was something I had a tendency to do in the very beginning with research into the mystery lights, because my group, which was made up of physicists and people that were exploring this with other physicists, and came to believe that not only was it applicable to this particular case, but it could be applicable probably to a host of other mysterious incidents of mystery lights, including the famous Mako lights and the famous Brown Mountain lights, and you name it. And of course, over time, I realized, no, Procrustean. It fit our experience, and it might fit some others, a few others, but it didn't fit a lot of the others. And it still doesn't. So we can't generalize to all these. So that kind of is, you know, um, the type of thing that I saw. And it's the same thing whether I was researching Howard Menger, you know. I didn't research Adamski because I think actually Jim Moseley had done a pretty darn good job of showing why this guy was probably making up, if not all of it, at least 99.9% of what was going on. But again, even with Adamski, I remember reading of reports of people independent of him that were having experiences. were these shills? Were these people that he was convinced to do that? I don't know, but that case to me never really had a lot going for it. That to me was something that you could clearly put in this category of a hoax. But some of the other cases I don't know about, including Menger, you know.
Well, we were talking earlier about Ray Stanford, who's a well-known researcher, and he had, I think, a twin brother who they met as
Yeah,
young men. They met Adamski,
Rex Stanford. He was a parapsychologist.
and they claimed that they had seen back then some sort of what they thought was a Adamski type scout ship or something.
Right, right.
Uh, but yet later on they realized he was, they didn't see him as really credible. So yet they had the experience and they couldn't deny that. So was it? I guess Rex probably uh, embraced more of a parapsychological explanation for it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Ray Stanford is to be somebody who's, enigmatic, brilliant, has done some research that I know is very, very interesting and very, very convincing. His research, for example, into the Socorro case, the book written, Saucer in a Pentagon Pantry, was a book that I always thought was, darn good. And I thought highly credible research. Um, then again, I remember years ago reading about how one of the first groups that he was involved in, he was making a lot of claims about himself being like almost like a contactee and having all of these strange contactee experiences. Um, and there were people within the group who actually broke off with him and just felt that he had gone off the rails. Um, Again,
Mm.
I don't know. I can't speak to that because I don't know. I don't know Ray. I only know of him. Um, but again, who's to say? You know, to say that somebody too is a scientist, and also uh, that their credibility is diminished because of the fact that they've had an experience
Hmm.
is not fair either. I mean, I've had experiences. I don't feel like it diminishes me, but I think what happens is when it comes to being in a public forum or going public with your experience or whatever, I think any scientist wants to maintain a certain image, you know? So they have a certain image that they want to maintain, especially if they are a scientist, like, I mean, a bona fide academe scientist. Let's take Alan Hynek. Okay, so I think Alan Hynek um, wanted desperately for science, astronomy, and you know the sciences to accept the reality of UFOs. Okay, and I think initially, I think in the very beginning, that's where all of his emphasis was on physical cases, um, reporting, and so forth and so on. And certainly, I'm talking even after Project Blue Book, where he was just dismissing everything. It was swamp gas, and I mean beyond that. Uh, Later, I think until Valet's influence was felt, um,
Hmm.
and I think just based on this is based on correspondence I saw and things that I read about. I think what was happening was slowly over time he was beginning to realize we're not we're not getting anywhere with just one model, you know, uh, that maybe we need to explore other models um, in order to explanatory models to help us with this because the ETH, I don't know, it doesn't fit everything. And again, I don't know if during his own research, if he was starting to hear about or or people were reporting to him some high strangeness aspects and he didn't know what to do with all that, because of
Hmm.
his stature and his standing at the time. But later, I think with Valet's influence, um, I think you start seeing that. There was that one book. Um, Gosh, what was the name of that book?
On the edge of reality.
Yeah, was that the one where they're kind of like having a dialogue?
Yes, yes.
I think I don't know what year that was, but I started seeing when I read that.
75.
When was it?
1975.
75.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So 75, he was already starting, I think, to talk about, to look into that particular aspect. Again, publicly, I don't recall him saying a lot to that effect. Still, I mean, Valet, sure, but Valet has from the very beginning. But I don't remember, again, because I think there was this sense of, and again, I guess you'd have to talk to his son, Alan Hynek's son, who wrote. I mean, it would be interesting to interview him. Where did this shift with his father? Did it shift dramatically? Did it change the way that he perceived the phenomenon, or maybe opened himself up to other investigations? I don't really know. You know, what I do know is you had Hynek, you had Hynek, Valet, and then you had Jerry Clark, okay, who went through a lot of different evolutions in thinking, you know,
Hmm.
and came to believe that. I remember when he wrote a paper, I think, with Thomas Bullard. Do you remember Thomas Bullard? He was
Hmm.
I
Folklore.
forget, a folklorist, and the two of them basically were trying to refute Valet's thesis, about UFOs. And I remember Jerry writing and saying, nobody, not a single person, has ever issued a full refutation of what we proved. I mean, that's how strongly that he felt, and I know he still probably still feels this way. But I can only wonder what was it like, because we have, I know Hynek was a close ally of his and friend. Um, what was that like with Hynek, Valet, and Jerry Clark, with these very, very different points of views sort of colliding in how they handled things in Kufos? You know, I don't know. I wasn't a part of that group,
Hmm.
or those experiences, but I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting, the evolution in thinking. I mean, I know another person that maybe we didn't touch upon was um, oh, what was his name? Um, Ted Phillips. Ted Phillips, who was, initially, or in the very beginning, uh, mainly focused and interested in ground traces. And that's all he was looking at, were ground traces. Everything was physical,
Yeah.
basically an ETH kind of perspective. And then over time, um, I think Marley Woods and the Marley Woods investigations that he conducted in the Ozarks. Oh, the Ozarks will do it to you. Missouri, there's a lot of high strangeness in Missouri, boy. Um, I think that really changed him dramatically. And I know his partner, I forget his name. I heard him on a podcast recently. Um, and
Mark
they were,
Rodinger.
yes, yeah. And supposedly they were working on a book about this. And it was always hard to find anything, because it was another one of those situations, was kind of like that, uh, the case we talked about in Colorado, where everything was shrouded in anonymity and you didn't know where the actual real location was, and they wouldn't give you the specific coordinates. So, which I understand. Hopefully in time we'll learn more, but what I did read about it briefly was fascinating. But they were having all this weird light phenomenon. There were cattle mutilations there, all kinds
Yeah.
of very strange things that were happening. And he got a lot of very nice videos and things, and came to believe that there were things there that could be interdimensional. And I think that's what Hynek came to believe. You know, and again, maybe it was because of the influence of Valet, or he was informed by his own research. You know,
Yeah.
I mean,
I know that Valet, when they met in 1963, I think it was um, that he made Hynek aware of like his work in the 1954 UFO wave and the landing
in
of
France.
occupant reports in France. Yeah,
Right, right. I know that.
and and Hynek had previously kind of gone along with the Air Force. That's probably just teenagers burned uh, a place in the grass or something,
Right, right,
and
right.
and they were generally put at the back of the file or in the circular file, and also occupant reports. They didn't give them much credibility at all.
Hmm.
So Hynek learned a lot right off the bat from ballet, and telling him of the cases that he considered credible from over there in France and perhaps other European countries as well. Involving occupants and landings,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
that opened his eyes up to and then of course when he investigated the Socorro, New Mexico incident, 1964,
Hmm.
uh, with the police officer. Even though there's some say that officer was actually hoaxed by some college students. That's another angle. That's always.
Yeah, I remember reading that, and I think Anthony Braglia, the attorney that we talked about, who has that UFO site, that's one. He has an area called hoaxes, and along with the Varahena case, recently that became the basis of a documentary by James Fox. Um, he also cites the Socorro incident as a very probable hoax, and then goes through all the details about these kids being involved. Kevin Randall, however, researched that pretty thoroughly, along with many of the other theories, including that it was a lunar module that maybe was being a prototype that was being tested in the area, and so many other things. In his book, I forget the name of it, but he wrote a book on Socorro not that long ago. Actually, an excellent book on it. And so when you look at that, you just realize that that doesn't really seem to hold much water. So, something happened there that I think was truly mysterious. I thought initially perhaps maybe it was some sort of kind of looked like a lunar type of module, uh, something very physical like that, that had that sound of something like a rocket going off, with this
Hmm.
fire coming out of the back of it, you know. But then I always have to remind myself of how mimetic the phenomenon is. When I was involved in poltergeistry, so many times phenomena that would occur would be imitative. So, for example, um, countless people would tell me that they would hear um, conversations of people, usually coming out of a corner of a room at night, whispered conversations. When they would go to actually strain to hear it, the voice would fade out. If I heard that once, I heard it a million times from different people. It was always that kind of dynamic. But the other thing was sometimes they would see people who were actual, like almost like spiritual doppelgangers of members of the family. So someone would see who they thought was their brother standing or coming through the room, only to go to look and see that the brother is fast asleep in a adjacent bedroom. Um, there would be dogs, sometimes phantom dogs that would appear, you know. Um, so uh, people would hear voices, and it would be voices of people they recognized, that weren't home at the time. They would yell out and the person wouldn't respond. But shortly after, the person would come home and they would say, "I just heard you talking to me." And they said, I was out shopping. How could you have heard
Mm.
me? My point is this: phenomena, much of paranormal phenomenon is very highly mimetic. Things look like other things. Um, and it's imitative in that particular respect. So one of the things I'm always have to remind myself of is the fact of how imitative UFO phenomenon often is. And we talked about this too in the context of hoaxes, where you have cases of UFOs appearing that appear to be or turned out to be or exposed as hoaxes, but in the same region, sometimes almost in the identical region, you would have appearances of objects and reports of objects by very credible witnesses, independent of the original hoaxing events, that appear to be credible. So one tries to figure out, well, wait a minute, how is that even possible? How could we have something that's inauthentic, existing by side, coexisting with something that is authentic? Well, then you haven't been researching this enough. That's my answer to everybody. You
Mhm.
have not been researching this enough. If you're at it long enough, eventually you're going to bump heads with a world in which you can have these things existing on different poles of experience that are coexisting at the same time, sometimes almost simultaneously. And that's simply a fact of life. That's a fact of existence as far as this kind of what we can call generally under the umbrella of 14 phenomenon. It's always that way, no matter what it is, you know. Um, so it's I don't know exactly where we were going with that, but the idea is I think that if you're an investigator like Alan Hynek and you're a serious investigator and you're very objective and you stick to the facts. If you're saying, I'm only going to stick to the facts, I'm not going to look here and I'm not going to look here. Here's where my vision is. It's going to be on this. Over time, maybe not initially. Yes, you can find some experiences or some events that you can explain pretty readily or easily. You may say, oh, we realized that that was a plane that that person saw. Or maybe you found there was a flock of seagulls, not the band, but a flock of birds that were seen. And maybe from the angle or the way you take it with the video, you know, or it was a bug that came through and the way the wings are formed and the digital, you create this artifact. I remember we did this with cameras just to see what would happen. And you get these things that look like UFOs fluttering through the air, going in a zigzag, sometimes even in a falling leaf, you know, and people say, see, that's that's the way UFOs behave. They have that falling leaf pattern. Well, here you have it, but it's an artifact, and you could have that in the same area where somebody saw something that clearly the size of a 747 and it's doing things that a 747 can't do, and you have these lights going around the bottom at the same time, and maybe even if it lands or there's ground traces or trees that are the limbs are cut off, there's scorch marks, et cetera, where the ground doesn't pick up water anymore like it used to. If you have those attendant things, you have to say, well, that didn't seem like a hoax. That seems like something where an object was seen in that area doing this, and that seems to be something genuine. But what is that? I don't know. But it's not a hoax, but it's in that same region. So what do we do with that? Well, it depends on who you are. If you're a tribalist who exists solely as a skeptic, you say, I'm going to make it all fit. I'll make it all fit. And I'm just going to use this. We know this person was a hoaxer, so therefore anyone who associates with this person is a hoaxer by default. And that's what they do. And that's, what I like to refer to as Procrustean science, whereas if it doesn't fit, we put it here and we force it so that it fits that particular explanation. That is not science. Science is not often what science does, somebody once said. And that's true. Science acts as if there's these very strict rules and everything's objective. No, most scientists have an agenda. They have to have an agenda
Mhm.
if they're attached to a university. They have an agenda. Um, even if they're allowed to write a book on UFOs and they're the chairman of the philosophy department, they have to write it in such a way that it doesn't say that they really believe in the phenomenon, if you ever notice, or that they're there to say we really need to take a serious look at this because this is an important thing. They're saying, no, I'm talking about the social, psychological effects of the phenomenon, and this is what these people believe. And I'm just studying. These are Native Americans who believe this is part of their culture. Let's look at the cultural ramifications of this within this particular society or so forth and so on. And that's how they're able to do a PhD on parapsychology because it's a subset of anthropology or sociology or psychology, but it's not the same thing. I'm not saying it's unimportant, it's not useful, and it's not something worth looking at, but what I'm saying is they have to be very careful what they're saying, you
Mhm.
know? And even if they're John Mack, right, at
Yeah.
Harvard, and you're tenured, it's still going to look askance and give you a hard time about this, right? Even if you want a Pulitzer, for for something very respectable in the range. Maybe we give you an allowance. We'll allow you to do this little kooky stuff that you're doing. It's not going to make any difference. But not everybody's in that kind of a position, right? And
Hmm.
maybe if you're Dr. Jacobs, right, and then you get tenured, well, they can't touch you. And so at that point, maybe you can get away with it, you know? But the point is, most scientists, including I'm sure Dr. Hynek at the time, right? Where was he? At the University of Michigan, was it? No, University
Northwestern.
Northwestern. So I'm sure, you know, you have to have a particular point of view. And if you go outside that line, different for valet, very different. When you're mostly a venture capitalist, right? You're working in business, and well, they don't care as long as you're building software, whatever you're doing for them. You're on a contract, or it has to do with investments, and that's okay. You're safe, But I'm saying with Heineck, it must have been a struggle, and I think that's
Yeah.
why he kept, even if he had some of those views, he had to keep them kind of at his chest. I met him once in 1990. I forget what conference it was. I was given a talk there, and I didn't have much of a conversation. I remember we were talking about the cattle mutilations, and I was just curious what he thought. And of course, he deferred to Jacques Vallée. He said Jacques would have more to say about this because he's been doing some research. And that's how I became aware of Barbara. Vallée had, do you remember this assistant that he had? I don't want to say an assistant. It was somebody that actually accompanied him on all of his research into cattle mutilations. And they wrote a book about her called, her name is Barbara. It'll come to me. And the book's name has escaped me. I still have a copy of it.
I
Uh,
think it starts with S.
oh, that's really going to bother me. Uh,
Oh, sorry.
Very interesting, very, very interesting woman, and a very interesting investigator. And what a interesting experience that was, not just for her. Remember, we talked about this, that some people I think have, maybe whatever they're going through in their life, whatever, they have weak boundaries. And those boundaries allow them perhaps to experience things more vibrantly, um, uh, and personally than maybe other people do who are able to put things at a distance. Um, Valet always struck me as someone who could keep this sort of here, keep it here, the way you should do it. He listens. He's very attentive. He's very detailed, but I never got the sense that Valet is embroiled in it or attached to it in the way that, let's say, John Keel was, or the way any of us, you know, in our little pursuits or little researches that we did, found ourselves being emotionally overinvested in the experiences. Valet wasn't that way. Um, Neither do I believe that Hynek was. I think Hynek was always kind of like, wish that wasn't there, but we have to face it, you know? And
Hmm.
so you have to embrace it at some point. But I don't think he allowed it to affect him. Barbara really gets affected. And not only does it affect her, but it starts affecting him and Valet. And you can see when you read this book, when they go out to do the mutilation research and all these things that they see, all the bizarre things that start happening to Barbara, and all the negative things and the fallout that she experiences because of her research. And Valet keeps tossing up saying, no, it's your imagination. You're getting too emotionally wrapped up. But then it started to affect him on some of their trips. And then eventually he broke off his research with her in the book. He said, I really don't want to be involved with you anymore. It's, it's a very interesting book. And it's not a book that I found many people have read. Um, but when you read between the lines there, you can just sort of see where Valet, if it starts getting a little bit too crazy, he's out of there. And that's a great defense mechanism. That's the way You know, that's the way we all should be. That's the way you have to be. If it gets to be too much, just pull away from it, at least for a while. I think of Nick Redfern. It's a perfect example of how to keep your sanity when everybody around you is losing theirs. Right? Nick Redfern writes all these books, and you say, well, God, he must be out of his mind writing about black-eyed children and Nessie and Bigfoot and all these conspiracy theories, about Marilyn Monroe and Johnny JFK. I just read one on his. He's got a book out like every week, right? And then I listened to him and I think this guy sounds so sane. What's the difference? The difference is he says, I don't have a pony in the race. I don't know what it is. I don't know any of this. I don't have a particular theory. So I'm going to write a book from a point of view that maybe you never considered before. Because too many books are written from the same point of view. Why don't we just say, let's see if there's any evidence that maybe Nessie is all supernatural, that there's no physical. Let me see what the evidence is for that. And he did. He wrote what amazing book on Nessie. Wrote
Mhm.
amazing books on Bigfoot. He wrote great books. And he says, I write like a job. I write every day. I get up at a certain time. And then when it's over, it's done. And I go out and I listen to bands and I drink and I go with my pens and I party. And then the next morning I do the same thing. And then when Friday comes and the weekend's there, it's party time for the whole weekend. And I don't talk about it and I don't research it and I don't think about it. And that, my friend, is an example of how to keep your sanity in the field. And boy, I think if more people did that, if I had done that back when, I think I wouldn't have ended up as emotionally distraught and paranoid as I became when I was researching cattle mutilations. And that's our segue into a topic that is not the most popular topic in the world. It's not like you look at your bookshelf and you go, wow, I have 12 books on this subject. No, you probably don't even have any. Most people don't even have one. Most people aren't even aware that there are books on the cattle mutilation. You know, that's that's how obscure that is. And yet, you know, I always found that to be one of the most fascinating things of anything I had ever heard about, especially given its physicality. Other than crop circles, right? Regardless of what you think, what is more physical than, you know, an 800 to 1200-pound bull being dropped in front of your ranch, upside down, hooves in the air? I don't know if you've ever tried to tackle a bull. I haven't, and I don't know many that would. They give up such a fight. And to see, when I started seeing pictures of cows like that, I thought, whoa, okay, how would I hoax that? Let's start with that, Okay, I get a chopper and I tie the cows up. And well, first I got to sedate it, right? Okay, so how am I going to sedate it? Okay, well, I hit it with a dart, right? And tranquilize it and fall down. And I pick it up and I bring it somewhere else. And then I do these very sharp cuts with a knife, let's say, or something. And then I lasso it back up and then I just drop it right back in the ranch and hope nobody sees me both times that I'm there. Even though all these ranchers have vicious guard dogs, which mysteriously are going to fall asleep on the night that we do this. How do you do that? I don't know. I don't have any idea how you could do that.